I do not like this book. That's okay, maybe that's a little too harsh. I would say I like about half of this book. I like the space half. The half where it happens on Earth is not very good. And I think it suffers because Andy Weir is trying to commit to like having no politics in this book. And I just want to talk about that. I haven't seen anyone talk about it. So before we can jump in, I guess I have to talk about the genre a little bit. Project Hail Mary and The Martian, Andy Weir's first novel, are both examples of Robinsonades. Robinsonades are stories where the main character is separated from society either by chance or maybe it's a voluntary separation, and they are thrown into nature. The novels then usually detail their survival attempts, their attempts to make contact, and then eventually their rescue. So it's a man versus nature story. Robinsonades get their name from the novel Robinson Crusoe, published in the late 1700s. This is a story about a man who, en route to Brazil to oversee his sugar plantation, we'll come back to that, is stranded on a deserted island in the Caribbean. The novel then details his attempts to survive, make contact with passing ships, and later his encounter with the native population, a tribe of cannibals. Robinson then rescues a prisoner of the cannibals. He names this man Friday. Friday is then civilized by Robinson and is informed of English culture. And when the pair are finally rescued, Friday decides to return with Robinson Crusoe to England to become his manservant. Lots to unpack there. Um, when Robinson Crusoe returns to England, he finds that he's been gone for a number of years and he's been declared legally dead. It's not a huge problem because his profits from the sugar plantation were never collected, so he has a giant fortune because it was run by enslaved people. Great story. Okay, you can see some like unfortunate parallels between Crusoe and Friday and Grace and Rocky. I think that's more just because of how the genre works. You know, you add in the additional character and you have to kind of explain why they're there. And then, the main character anthropomorphizes them. In another novel in this genre, My Side of the Mountain, the main character domesticates a falcon. In the movie Castaway, Tom Hanks famously talks to a Wilson's volleyball and then names the character Wilson. So, it's just a way to break up and add dialogue to the story, which is typically, again, just a lot of problem solving, right? And there's still a ton of problem solving in Project Hail Mary and The Martian. Yeah. And I think like having read about this genre now, I probably just don't like stories in this genre. While I think a lot of people criticize Andy Weir for the similarities between The Martian and Project Hail Mary, I think that's just because of how the genre is. Um, you have to have a reason to get these characters away from nature, and then you have to have a way for them to be able to survive in the nature, right? So, if you want to write a Robinsonade in space, your character has to have some background that's going to like prepare him for this. And a lot of what Project Hail Mary's Earth scenes do is to explain why Grace is in this situation and also why he's good at it. So Project Hail Mary has two narratives, one where it's happening on Earth and one where Grace is remembering what's happening on Earth and he is in space trying to solve what's going on with the Astrophage. Um, so Grace is sort of reliving these memories sequentially, and I think that's fine. Like I don't know how amnesia works. I don't know if that's how it really, if that's how your memories come back. It doesn't really bother me, um, and I think this does serve to like differentiate the novel from his previous work, The Martian. But I think that's where my issues come in because I think I like all the space stuff, but then as you explain why he's in space, you have to sort of take some creative liberties and then you have to justify why he's at certain scenes to understand what's going on. It's later revealed the reason he's on the Project Hail Mary in the first place is because the original crew and their backup died, and Strott drugged him and placed him on the Project Hail Mary against his will. So the amnesia is because of a drug that she's given him, which is like super dangerous, especially since you want like a scientist who's going to be able to be competent to solve the astrophage. Um, but then the novel kind of justifies Strott's decision by having her correctly read him and predict that he would go into like a savior mode in that situation. I don't love that, and it's very much glossed over in the novel and the movie. As someone who is not like a science person, I did think this novel did a good job of explaining like scientific concepts, physics, rudimentary stuff to like get you engaged with the novel, and also explain the astrophage and also explain how Rocky's world works. I do have to say it kind of toes a line of being a little condescending at times. I think Grace, his stream of consciousness of like constantly problem solving, constantly like thinking about things in a scientific way is a little exhausting. And I think when the narrative is like first person, it sucks. It kind of just sucks the life out of it. But when you have it in third person, like in a movie, he's a lot more just quirky. He's a lot more of just like a character, and you're not constantly like thinking about how he only thinks in like terms of physics. Because Grace is like such an everyman, and he's like such a generalist that he's able to like pick up skills really fast. He's kind of like a Mary Sue, and I have not really seen people like talk about this, but like Grace is just good at everything. And whenever like he's like, why am I good at that? Like he just has a convenient flashback to explain how he was like able to like pick up the skills in the first place. Like there's a part where he's remembering how to do like an EVA, and he's like, why am I even good at this? And then it flashes back to him like training in the EVAs to show the scientists and the alternates like how to use their equipment. And it's like, I don't know if he would even need to be in there if they could just have someone else be doing it for him. Like, and then there are times where Grace is present for conversations where he just doesn't really need to be. And I think I struggle to see how you can fix that problem, because if you want to have a macro picture of like the Project Hail Mary systems on Earth, you do need his character there. But his character never really needs to be in the same room as Strahd for a lot of these conversations. And sometimes these just function as like mic drop moments for Strahd to show how like cool and badass and like how much authority she has. I think some scenes make sense why Grace is present. Grace is a microbiologist PhD, so he is pretty qualified to study the astrophage. Like I don't have a problem with like the premise of the teacher with a PhD getting recruited to study these, right? Like that's totally fine to me. I think where I have a problem is like when other smart characters go to him for consultation when they're just as smart and have been like actively been in academia. There's one scene where I think like his condescension like really comes through, and I think it's just by purely accident. So it's explaining why the astrophage can block out radiation, and the astrophage just absorbs so much light that they're just completely like, it's kind of like Vanta Black, where it's just like almost like a black hole where no light is getting through. And so the scientist, Dr. Lachlan, wants to design the ship and have the astrophage line the walls to prevent the scientist from radiation poisoning. And she is an ESA director. She goes up to Dr. Ryland Grace and says, hey, what do you know about radiation? And then he explains radiation to her. And I think there's just a better way to do it, because it does sound very condescending. It does also kind of belittle Dr. Lachlan. And it does seem weird that like Dr. Lachlan is a woman scientist who is asking like a male unqualified scientist like about space radiation when he is qualified about microbiology. I don't know, maybe like I'm nitpicking, but like it just rubbed me the wrong way. I think it says something really strange about me, that I can believe in alien life, but I cannot believe for 1 second that the UN is a competent organization that its member nations adhere to. The narrative of the Earth sections center around this woman, Eva Strahd, who has been empowered by the UN to have all this authority, all this power, influence, money to solve what's going on with the sun. And that's fine, I guess. It runs into a lot of problems. Andy Weir isn't super interested in like the ethics of empowering Eva Strahd like this. He's interested in like the process of making the Project Hail Mary, but he's not interested in like the politics to make it happen. So a lot of it becomes like hand wavy. And there's one scene where Eva Stratt is in U.S. like copyright law, in U.S. copyright court, where the justices are bringing a motion against her about their use of information on the Project Hail Mary that's going to be for like the use of the crew. And she just says something that like, your nation's already signed a treaty with us, so actually I can do whatever I want. And then she like brings in the U.S. military, and she's like, the U.S. military is my authority, and they're a damn fine authority, or something like that. And it's just like such a mic drop moment, and it's so corny. It really took me out of it. But that's not even like the worst scene. There's another scene where they blow up Antarctica. They bring on this science guy, Dr. Leclerc, who is an environmental scientist, and he like is giving them projections about like climate collapse due to the dimming of the sun. And so their brilliant plan is to put U.S. nuclear warheads underneath Antarctica to cause a chain reaction explosion to drop the ice into the ocean and release the methane underneath it. Um, I don't know where to begin with that, and I think it's kind of self evident, right? Like, what do you mean? What do you mean the U.S. just gave you a bunch of warheads to do that? What do you mean it worked? What do you mean you're gonna do it again? Like, the idea is that they're gonna keep doing it again, and there's just all these things that are like, I think maybe like on its own, maybe each scene would be fine, but there's just another one and another one where she's just demonstrating this authority and like global cooperation that like isn't super interesting because it's so easy. Okay, so a lot of the Earth scenes didn't make it into the movie. And a lot of those Earth scenes show that Dr. Ryland Grace was really involved with the design of the Project Hail Mary from like every step. And one of the steps that he was involved with was breeding the astrophage. So Dr. Ryland Grace, first person to breed them, so he is brought on to breed more of them, right? What happens is Eva Stratt is sent an email from a maximum security prison in New Zealand. So they go there and they interview Dr. Riddell. Dr. Riddell is in jail for criminal negligence. Dr. Riddell was overseeing a solar thermal plant in the Sahara Desert when an accident killed about 7 members of his crew and like scientists. Um, the reason it was like a freak accident, but he was gambling and embezzling money, so he was like thrown in jail, and he is like rightfully deserves to be in jail. He did a bad thing, he fucked up, and he should be held accountable for that, right? So Dr. Riddell has like a proposal to build more astrophage breeders in the Sahara Desert. Funny exchange between Dr. Ryland Grace and Dr. Riddell about why New Zealand was in the Sahara Desert in the first place. So, and I quote, and that's what you were making for New Zealand. Well, it was funded by New Zealand, but the idea was to provide power for Africa. Why wouldn't New Zealand just pay a bunch of money just to help Africa? I asked. Because we're nice, Riddell said. Wow, I said. I know New Zealand is pretty cool, but and it was going to be a New Zealand-owned company that charged the power, Riddell said. There it is. Right, so this is funny. I actually like this joke. Like, this is a little funny. Like, the naive guy, he's like a little skeptical of it, but then he like wants to believe in the goodness of hearts. And then Riddell is like, no, we actually are going to like get the profits from this, right? Like, this is soft power imperialism. We're building this, to help people, and it is going to help people, but it's also going to really boost New Zealand more than anything. So, like, Andy Weir can acknowledge that these interventions in other nations are often not very good. Sometimes they come with like strings, and a lot of times it is like for-profit interventions or like imperialism. So what are they doing with Dr. Riddell? Well, Dr. Riddell sent them designers for breeder tanks for the astrophage. Basically, it's kind of like a solar panel with like a bunch of glass on top of it that traps the astrophage in there. And as they're beamed with sunlight in the Sahara Desert, they're going to absorb that heat, and they'll be ready to breed. And that way you can scale this like small setup infinitely large, right? As much as you needed. And conveniently, he has some experience of working in the Sahara Desert. So they, like, I need you to like think this through. Andy Weir like criticizes this guy for building a power plant in the Sahara Desert that is going to be owned by New Zealand, and is going to like give them profits. And then his solution is like to use the same guy to build power plants that is going to be used for the profits of like rich countries, right? That are like running the Project Hail Mary. Later on in this exchange, I think like 2 pages later, he says, "See, there we go. There we go," he said. "Save the world and permanently lift Africa out of poverty while we're at it. Of course, this is all just a theory. I have to develop the black panels and make sure we can mass produce it, blah, blah, blah." Like, save the world and lift Africa out of poverty while we're at it, right? Like, that's just, there's just such like a condescension in that like statement. Like, I think this exchange could also just be solved if you had like a local scientist from like, you know, a sub-Saharan country or like a Sahara desert country, right? Like, there's no need for him to be Riddell, but like for some reason Andy Weir's like, no, like the only guys in charge of this are like white people, right? Like, and I don't even think Andy Weir is being racist on purpose. I think he just doesn't have the imagination to think that like other scientists can bring stuff to the table, that there are like other perspectives, right? I think Andy Weir is just like married to the scientific theory so much that like, you know, the people that are good at it should just be in charge, right? And the people that are good at it are people that have had historical access to it. So there's no like unpacking what he's propagating, right? Like there's no reflection on any. I'm doing so many hand movements. I'm so sorry if you're bored of that. Okay, I want to read this quote from this book that like is the inspiration. I held up the book as if like you guys don't know which book I'm talking about. That was really dumb. I'm gonna leave it in. There's a quote from this book that is like the inspiration for this whole video. I found it super weird. It's in chapter 23, and it's when Strott and Ryland Grace are talking about whether or not he's going to be the astronaut that steps up and like joins the Project Hail Mary. And well, I'm a teacher. I should teach. We need to raise a strong, solid generation of survivors. Right now, we're soft. You, me, and the whole Western world. We're the result of growing up in unprecedented comfort and stability. It's the kids of today that'll have to make the world of tomorrow work, and they're going to inherit a mess. I can really do a lot more by preparing kids for the world that's to come, and I should stay here on Earth where I'm needed. So this stood out to me because this is like bullshit, right? And, you know, to Andy Weir's credit, Eva Strott calls him out on this quote. She calls him out on this bullshit and thinks that he's just being a coward, right? But like the idea that like strong men create good times and good times create weak men, and then weak men create bad times, which create strong men, is like a right wing, I don't know exactly what it's called, dog whistle kind of thing. Like this is something that like Steve Bannon like earnestly like believes. This is like bullshit. And like it's also super weird to me from like a character's perspective because Dr. Ryland Grace has never once thought about the Western world, right? Like Dr. Ryland Grace has a ton of friends like in Russia now. Commander Yao is a contemporary of his. Like he has interacted with people that are not in the West, and yet he's like, when he's like push comes to shove and he's like scared, he defaults back to this like nationalist Western world like psyche. And I don't really understand why that's included in this novel. Like, I obviously understand that like he's just being a coward, but I was just like kind of shocked that this was in this book because largely before this, it was super apolitical. It wasn't super interested in like the themes it was bringing up, and then here it's like, wait, what's going on? Because this is like a very political statement to make. And Andy Weir is somebody who is not interested in making political statements. And I haven't really seen anyone else bring it up. And I think it's, you know, not only is it bad writing in the terms of like characterization, I think it's also just like a dumb idea to like propagate. And you know, I guess as I said this before, to Andy Weir's credit, he does like criticize this idea immediately afterwards. I was super curious why this like quote was in the book. And I did some digging. It actually was super easy. On his Wikipedia page, he identifies as fiscally conservative but socially liberal. This is cited from like a Reddit AMA post, which about 10 years ago, so maybe his politics have changed. And they actually haven't, because I'm going to read you more quotes from him. While on The Critical Drinker, Andy Weir had this to say: "I think you and me are on the same wavelength when it comes to fiction writing," he explained. I never put any politics or messaging in any of my stories at all. There's no deeper meaning. There isn't even any symbolism, even non-political. There's just no symbolism at all. My books are purely to entertain. Okay, so like socially liberal, fiscally conservative is a super loaded term that like has been used often as like a polite way of saying that like I'm okay with gay marriage, I'm okay with like pro-choice, but like I'm voting for like my taxes. I'm voting for like smarter business decisions, right? Even though sorry, I'm not going to get off tangent here. When push comes to shove, socially liberal and fiscally conservative people are always voting fiscally conservative in mind, right? And this puts them on the same side as people that are socially conservative, right? So they're okay with people being, in theory, they're okay with pro choice, but what ends up happening is the people that are supporting their tax policies that they like are anti choice, right? They do not want people to have a say in what they can do with their bodies, right? So they're okay with making that judgment because that decision is not going to affect them, right? It's inherently like a privileged position to have this viewpoint that you're okay with social issues, but you're not going to spend money on them. You don't want to fuck with the money, right? Like it's a super frustrating position, and it's kind of just why we're in the general shit show that we are in the United States. Um, that is as polite as I can get. I can feel my blood pressure rising as I talk about this issue, so I'm just going to kind of stop here and just abruptly cut. And then he has this quote on the critical drinker where there's no symbolism, there's nothing political in his stories. And I think that's stupid because everything is political. Everything is that deep. I am the friend that is too woke. And that's why I kind of brought up the Robinson Crusoe story from the beginning, right? Robinson Crusoe is a story that's made to entertain. But written in the 1700s, we can see that it is not critical of the dominant social political like world, right? It is not critical of slavery as an institution. In fact, it's cool that Robinson Crusoe is like taken care of because he has this plantation that he doesn't have to run because they're enslaved people running it, right? Like, yes, I can probably agree with you that like the author of Robinson Crusoe did not really think about politics, but it is a political work. It is interacting with political issues of its time, and it is in favor of those issues, right? So Andy Weir's novel, The Project Hail Mary, is interacting with this political institution, the UN, and it is making like political decisions in its story, right? They are doing interventionism. It's a little bit more on board with like the five Security Council members like doing the intervention, right? Like China and the U.S. building these black panels in the Sahara Desert, but that is inherently just a political thing that you've thrown into your novel that you really didn't need to. And so I also think that like it's bad writing to say that it is an apolitical novel. It's bad writing to say that you're not interested in the politics of it because you've thrown in these scenes that don't make sense if you're not going to explore the political implication. I do think that like the politics of Project Hail Mary aren't super in depth. They're not very clear. And when they were adapting the movie, they cut a lot of these Earth scenes out. They streamlined him being in space. I think that like sometime, it could be argued that they went too far with like dumbing down Ryland Grace, but I think he's much more pleasant in the movie. I think he's much less of a Mary Sue, and I also think that by cutting out a lot of these Earth scenes, the movie is less weighed down by like the messy politics of Andy Weir, who didn't want to commit to his politics, but like they're in this novel anyway, right? I think they made a lot of smart cuts. Um, and I think that like going forward, if I ever want to revisit the story, I'm going back to the movie. I'm not going back to this book. And I saw somewhere that there's a report that there's like a 3 hour, 3.5 hour long like director's cut. If there's more Earth scenes, that's bad. That's a terrible idea. I think it would weigh down this book. I think it would weigh down the movie if they add in a lot of those scenes they cut. So hopefully they didn't do that. I think Ryan Gosling's like charisma really helps sell like Ryland Grace. I think sometimes he's like a little insufferable. So I think just smart decisions all around adapting this novel into a great movie. Thank you for watching this whole video. I want to give you guys a book recommendation. If you liked Project Hail Mary, and maybe you're not like a huge science person, and maybe you want something with like a little bit more like real stakes and more about like the people working on these projects, I cannot recommend enough The Effort by Claire Holroyd. This is a story about an asteroid that's about to hit the Earth, and it's kind of about like all the different people that are working on the project to stop the asteroid, right? So you have astrophysicists, you have engineers, and then you also have like a UN translator. And then on top of that, you have one-off chapters like exploring how like society is like kind of fraying at the edges, coming to terms with like the possible end of humanity. And while this is going on, there is another narrative with a poet who like just wants to get home to Brazil, and he's living in exile because of like political tension. So I think it's a very human novel, and I think it covers like so much of like what my criticism with Project Hail Mary are, and it's a very thoughtful novel and very like reflective. So I this might be one of my favorite books. Cannot recommend it enough. Thank you for watching. I think if you there's something you can take away is just that like I think we shouldn't shy away from politics in stories that are meant to entertain. And I think this book is political, and I really enjoy it, and it's really entertaining. And I think Project Hail Mary is really entertaining, and it is inherently political because of the story he's telling. But it would benefit from him leaning into politics, even if I didn't agree with his politics. It would add more to the story about like what he is trying to say and what like he thinks about this. I hope that makes sense. I hope I don't sound insane. I'm talking too long. Thank you for watching. I'm trying to make more of these faster, and I'm still working on my conclusions.